It all started on a sunny Tuesday morning. The air was warm, the birds were singing, and the neighborhood seemed peaceful as usual. The protagonist, who had moved into the house a few years ago, was sipping coffee on the front porch, enjoying the quiet moment before the day began. Life had been simple, mostly calm, and the yard had always been a source of pride. It was filled with a mix of flowers, small shrubs, and decorative stones that gave it a unique personality. The neighbors often complimented the arrangement, saying it made the street feel more lively and inviting. But that peaceful morning was about to change. A letter slid under the front door, plain and official looking. The envelope had the HOA logo stamped on the top. The protagonist frowned slightly, recognizing it immediately. HOA letters were rarely good news, and there was a small knot of anxiety forming in the stomach. With a deep breath, the protagonist picked up the letter and carefully opened it. The notice was direct and firm. It stated that certain parts of the yard were not in compliance with the HOA guidelines. Specific mentions included the arrangement of flower beds and the types of shrubs planted near the walkway. The letter warned that if these issues were not corrected within 30 days, fines would be imposed, and further action could be taken. The protagonist sat down on the porch steps, the letter trembling slightly in hand. There was a mix of confusion and frustration. For years, the yard had been maintained carefully. Every plant had been chosen to complement the others. Every stone had been placed with thought. How could this suddenly be a problem? The rules in the HOA booklet had always been confusing, but this seemed excessive. It felt like the rules were being enforced selectively, and for a moment, a wave of anger passed through. After a few minutes of quiet, the protagonist decided to take a closer look. Walking along the yard, the notice was compared against the actual setup. Some of the flowers were slightly taller than expected, yes, but nothing excessive. The shrubs near the walkway were healthy and trimmed neatly. It seemed like a minor detail had been blown out of proportion. And yet the HOA had seen fit to make it an official complaint. Neighbors began to appear as the morning continued. A few waved politely, and one even stopped to ask if everything was okay. The protagonist smiled faintly, not wanting to involve anyone in what was clearly a private frustration. But inside, the mind was already turning over possibilities. This was more than just a small correction. It felt like a challenge, a test of patience and resolve. In the following days, the protagonist tried to comply at first, maybe trimming the shrubs a little differently, adjusting the flowers, or rearranging some stones would satisfy the HOA. There was a genuine effort to fix the so-called problem. But every small adjustment seemed to lead to more questions. Was it enough? Would they approve? Would another letter arrive demanding more changes? This pattern quickly became discouraging. While some neighbors had yards in similar or even worse condition, they never received notices. The protagonist began to notice patterns in the HOA's behavior, subtle preferences that seemed unfair. Some rules were applied strictly to certain houses while ignored in others. It didn't feel like enforcement. It felt like targeting. This realization sparked a mixture of determination and frustration. One evening, after a long day of small adjustments that never seemed to satisfy, the protagonist sat in the living room, staring out the window at the yard. The house was quiet, and the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the garden. For a moment, the frustration faded, replaced by a clear sense of purpose. The yard had always been more than just grass and flowers. It was a reflection of personality, of creativity, of care. It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about expressing individuality in a way that added beauty, not harm, to the community. The next day, protagonist began a quiet investigation. Every morning before work, small steps were taken to research the HOA guidelines more carefully. Online forums were explored, gardening magazines were skimmed, and local experts were contacted. It was surprising how many people had faced similar struggles. Many had simply given in, trimming and rearranging without ever feeling satisfied. Others had quietly pushed back, finding clever ways to work within the rules while still keeping their yards beautiful. Through this research, the protagonist realized that the HOA rules were often vague. Words like tidy, neat, or appropriate were open to interpretation. What one person saw as perfect, another could see as wrong. And the more the protagonist read, the more the mind started to spin with ideas. There had to be a way to transform the yard in a way that was unmistakably beautiful, undeniable in its charm, yet still completely compliant. Meanwhile, the neighborhood continued its routines. Children played along the sidewalks. Cars drove past slowly in the afternoons, and other homeowners watered their gardens or chatted over fences. The protagonist began observing these routines more closely, taking notes on what the HOA seemed to notice during inspections. Certain patterns emerged. The HOA would drive slowly down the street mid-morning, checking lawns and flower beds. They focused on easily visible areas, often ignoring corners, backyards, or subtle creative touches. This small but important observation became a key piece in planning the next steps. Frustration began to shift into a strange mix of excitement and determination. What started as an annoying obstacle now felt like a challenge. It wasn't about breaking rules or confronting the HOA directly. It was about creating something so thoughtful, so attractive, that criticism would be impossible. Each morning, the protagonist walked around the yard imagining new layouts, visualizing combinations of color, texture, and shape that could transform the space. Native plants, drought-resistant shrubs, pathways lined with stones, and clusters of flowers in contrasting shades became part of a mental blueprint. Late one night, sitting at the kitchen table with a notebook and a cup of tea, the protagonist began sketching ideas. Every line and curve represented a deliberate choice. Every plant and rock placement had a purpose. It wasn't just landscaping, it was planning a small revolution of beauty. A way to reclaim control without being reckless or confrontational. The sense of empowerment grew. This wasn't just about the yard anymore. It was about standing up for personal creativity and proving that rules didn't have to mean uniformity or dullness. As the days passed, small experiments were tried. A few stones were rearranged, a tiny patch of flowers replanted, and a new shrub added along the walkway. Each small success brought satisfaction, and even as the HOA remained silent for the moment, the protagonist felt that momentum was building. Neighbors started to notice subtle changes. Some complimented the effort casually, others whispered in curiosity. The protagonist didn't mind the attention. It was validation that the work was moving in the right direction, despite the frustration that had begun the whole ordeal. A quiet sense of calm began to settle. The protagonist realized that the battle wasn't with the HOA as much as it was with fear and doubt. The rules, the letters, the fines, they were obstacles, yes, but they didn't have to dictate creativity. With patience, observation, and thoughtful action, it was possible to turn what felt like a punishment into an opportunity. By the end of the first week, the yard still looked mostly the same, but the mindset had shifted completely. Where there had once been annoyance and confusion, now there was strategy and vision. The protagonist spent each evening jotting down observations, sketching ideas, and imagining how the finished landscape might look. It wasn't about winning against the HOA directly. It was about creating something undeniable. Something that would make even the strictest inspector pause and admire. The story of the first week closed quietly. With the sun dipping below the rooftops and the first evening breeze stirring the leaves, the protagonist stood at the porch once again, sipping coffee. But now the feelings were different. The yard was no longer just a patch of grass and flowers. It was a canvas, waiting to be transformed. The HOA may have thought they had control, that they could dictate every plant and stone. But the protagonist knew something they didn't. Patience, creativity, and careful planning could change everything. The first step in this journey had been taken. The battle wasn't over, and there were still challenges ahead. Letters could come, complaints could arrive, and the HOA might think they had the upper hand. But the protagonist had discovered something far more powerful than rules or fines. The ability to see possibility where others saw limitation, and to act with vision, patience, and quiet determination. And with that thought, the first chapter of this quiet rebellion came to an end, leaving a sense of anticipation in the air. The yard waited patiently, holding the promise of transformation, while the protagonist prepared for the next phase of a plan that was only just beginning. The next morning, The protagonist woke with a sense of purpose. The previous week had been full of letters, frustration, and silent observation. But now, it was time to take the quiet planning to the next level. The yard was more than just grass and flowers. It was a canvas, and it was time to sketch the first strokes in reality. The day began with research. The protagonist pulled out gardening books, magazines, and articles that had been bookmarked online. The focus was on plants that could thrive in the local climate, flowers that added color and life, shrubs that required little maintenance but made a strong visual impact. There were notes about arranging colors to create patterns that felt natural yet artistic, and ideas for stone pathways that could guide the eye through the yard without feeling rigid or forced. Each page turned sparked new excitement. But research alone wasn't enough. The protagonist made a list of local nurseries and landscaping suppliers. Visiting these places became a mission, not just to buy plants, but to see what could inspire creativity. Walking among rows of blooming flowers and stacks of stones, the protagonist imagined how each element could fit into the yard. Some items were bold and eye-catching. Others were subtle, adding texture or balance. Every choice was deliberate. It was no longer about simply satisfying the HOA, it was about creating something memorable. During these visits, the protagonist also started asking questions, learning from staff who had years of experience. Which plants survived long summers? Which flowers attracted birds or butterflies? Which shrubs added height without looking overgrown? Every answer added another piece to the puzzle. By the end of the week, there was a mental map of how the yard could transform, a combination of color, texture, and natural shapes that would feel vibrant and welcoming. Meanwhile, the protagonist paid close attention to the neighborhood. Observing neighbors' yards became almost a daily habit. Some were simple, tidy, and neat. Others were elaborate, full of decorative elements, but seemed untouched by HOA complaints. Patterns emerged. The HOA appeared to focus mostly on front-facing elements visible from the street. They rarely examined corners, side paths, or subtle design touches. This information was invaluable. The protagonist realized that while following the rules was important, there was room for creativity in areas that the HOA seldom inspected. Back at home, evenings were spent sketching. The protagonist drew diagrams, outlining flower beds, pathways, and the placement of stones. Each sketch was revised several times, adjusting the curves of paths and the grouping of plants. There were notes about seasonal colors, ensuring that the yard would look inviting throughout the year. Even small details like where sunlight would fall or where water runoff might affect plants were considered carefully. It was meticulous work, but it felt exciting. It felt like planning a personal masterpiece. The first real action began quietly, almost unnoticed by neighbors. A few old plants were removed and some stones were rearranged. The protagonist worked slowly, ensuring that each small change could later fit into the bigger design. It wasn't about rushing. It was about setting the foundation for something lasting. Even though the HOA hadn't yet sent another letter, the protagonist felt ready. This was about taking control, about turning frustration into something tangible and positive. One afternoon, while taking a break on the porch, the protagonist noticed a neighbor stopping to admire the yard. "You've been busy," they said with a smile. "It looks different, but nice." The protagonist smiled back politely, careful not to reveal too much. The compliment felt good, but it also reminded that people were watching. Every step had to balance personal creativity with the realities of the community's expectations. Over the next few days, more detailed planning began. The protagonist mapped out areas for taller shrubs, sections for low-growing flowers, and spaces where decorative stones could form natural borders. There were considerations for foot traffic, ensuring that paths were practical while maintaining an artistic flow. Even lighting was considered, imagining how the yard would look in the evening when soft garden lights highlighted plants and stones. Every element was deliberate, every choice part of a larger vision. The protagonist also reached out to a local landscaping expert for advice. They didn't hire the expert for actual work, but to get guidance on plant selection and layout ideas. The experts suggested plants that could add height without blocking views. flowers that thrived in different soil types, and stones that could create subtle patterns. The protagonist listened carefully, taking notes and adjusting the sketches. It was like piecing together a puzzle, and each suggestion made the mental picture clearer. At the same time, the HOA remained mostly silent. There were no new letters, no inspections, and no warnings. This quiet gave the protagonist an advantage. While the HOA believed they had control, the real work was happening in secret. There was freedom to experiment, to test layouts, and to refine the design without constant interference. This period became one of reflection as well. The protagonist thought about the frustration of the first week and realized that it had transformed into motivation. What had started as an annoyance had become a project full of creativity, strategy, and personal expression. One evening, the protagonist experimented with the placement of a small stone pathway. It curved gently through the yard, weaving between flower beds and shrubs. At first it felt strange, like it didn't belong. But after stepping back and observing the effect from the porch, the balance became clear. The curve invited the eye to travel naturally, creating movement and energy in a space that had previously felt static. Even without the final plants in place, the layout already felt alive. The following morning brought another burst of energy. The protagonist began small planting experiments, combining colors and textures. Bright yellow flowers were paired with deep green shrubs, while clusters of lavender added both scent and visual appeal. Native plants were chosen to attract birds and butterflies, creating life beyond just aesthetics. Each small planting was an experiment, a chance to see what worked and what didn't. And each success built confidence. Neighbors continued to notice subtle changes. Some stopped to ask questions, expressing curiosity about the new arrangements. Others watched quietly from their windows, perhaps wondering how far this transformation would go. The protagonist didn't mind the attention. It was not about showing off. It was about creating something genuine, a space that felt alive, personal, and welcoming. Meanwhile, the protagonist documented everything. Notes were taken about sunlight, soil quality, and the growth patterns of plants. Adjustments were made as needed, ensuring that every element was positioned to thrive. There was a quiet joy in these observations. The yard was becoming a living experiment, a blend of creativity, science, and personal taste. Each day brought new lessons, new insights, and new ways to improve the space. By the end of the second week, the yard had begun to show noticeable change. The first plantings were established, small pathways were forming. Areas that had once been bland were now lively with color and texture. The protagonist felt a deep sense of satisfaction, realizing that the work so far was laying the foundation for something extraordinary. The HOA may have thought they had control. They couldn't see the bigger picture unfolding quietly in this yard. Evenings were now dedicated to reflection. The protagonist would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, looking over the yard and imagining the final result. It wasn't just about beauty anymore. It was about personal growth. Patience, planning, and observation had become tools, and creativity had become a weapon of quiet resistance. Each decision, no matter how small, reinforced the sense that control could be reclaimed in subtle, meaningful ways. As the second week closed, the protagonist felt a growing anticipation. The plan was becoming clearer, the vision sharper. Every stone, flower, and shrub was part of a larger picture. And every small adjustment brought the yard closer to something unforgettable. The HOA may have sent letters or threatened fines, but they couldn't dictate imagination, creativity, or thoughtful planning by now. The protagonist had learned something important. Rules could guide, but they didn't have to limit. Even within strict guidelines, there was room to innovate, to create, and to transform. And with patience, careful observation, and deliberate action, the yard could become more than just a space of grass and flowers. It could become a statement, a quiet declaration that beauty and individuality could thrive even under the most rigid scrutiny. The protagonist knew the real work was just beginning. The foundation had been laid, the research completed, and the first experiments tested. The next steps would involve larger changes, bolder decisions, and more visible transformation. But for now, there was satisfaction in knowing that the plan was solid, the vision clear, and the strategy unfolding perfectly. And so, as the sun set and the evening breeze stirred the leaves, the protagonist stood on the porch once more, looking at the yard with quiet pride. The battle with the HOA had not yet been won, but the quiet planning, careful observation, and small, deliberate actions were already setting the stage for something remarkable. The yard was no longer just a piece of land. It was a canvas waiting for its masterpiece, and the protagonist was ready to create it. The second chapter of this quiet rebellion had begun, filled with research, planning, and subtle action. And with each passing day, the yard moved closer to becoming not just compliant, but extraordinary, something the HOA could never ignore, and something the protagonist could be proud of for years to come. The following morning, the protagonist stepped outside with renewed energy. After weeks of research, sketches, and small experiments, it was finally time to begin the real transformation. The yard, which had been a simple patch of grass and flowers, was about to change in a way that no one could ignore. But this change would not be rushed. Every movement, every placement had to be thoughtful and deliberate. The first task was clearing space for the new design. Some old plants were removed, not carelessly, but carefully uprooted to make room for new shrubs and flowers. Rocks were lifted, rearranged, and cleaned. It was hard work, the kind that left muscles sore and hands scratched, but the protagonist welcomed it. Each movement was a step toward the vision that had been forming in sketches and daydreams. Even the dirt itself seemed to take on a new significance, as if preparing to support something extraordinary. Neighbors began to notice the activity. Some stopped to wave politely. Others peered over fences curiously. The protagonist didn't mind the attention. It was simply part of life in the neighborhood. And yet, there was a quiet thrill in knowing that these early stages were invisible to the HOA. The work was hidden in plain sight. The first moves of a game that would soon unfold in full view. With the space cleared, planting began. The protagonist had carefully selected plants that were both visually appealing and low maintenance. Taller shrubs were placed toward the back, creating natural boundaries and height variation, while clusters of flowers were arranged in patterns that seemed organic, but were designed to catch the eye. Each placement had been considered sunlight, soil conditions, and even how the plants would grow over time. It wasn't just about filling space. It was about shaping the way the yard would be experienced. Paths were next. Small stones were arranged to form gentle curves that guided the eye through the yard. They weren't rigid or straight, but flowed naturally, inviting anyone walking past to look closer. The protagonist spent time stepping back, walking along the paths, and adjusting placement until each curve felt right. It was slow, deliberate work, but the effect was already visible. The yard was beginning to feel alive, dynamic, and carefully composed. The first week of transformation was physically exhausting. Hands were scraped from stones and soil, back ached from bending, and dirt seemed to cling to everything. But each evening, when the work paused and the protagonist stood on the porch, looking at the changes, there was a deep sense of satisfaction. The yard had started to reveal the vision that had existed only in sketches and imagination. It was subtle at first, but undeniably moving toward something extraordinary. Evenings became a time of reflection. The protagonist would sit with a cup of tea, watching the light change across the yard, imagining how it would look with every plant in full bloom. There was a quiet joy in this process, a sense of personal triumph that didn't need validation from the HOA or anyone else. The yard was no longer just a piece of property. It was becoming a statement, a reflection of patience, creativity, and determination. By the second week, the transformation was more visible. The shrub arrangements gave depth, the flower clusters added bursts of color, and the stone paths created a sense of movement. Even without final touches, the yard had a new personality. It no longer felt like a generic suburban lawn. It felt intentional, unique, and welcoming. The protagonist could sense the change not just in the yard, but in how the neighborhood perceived it. Eyes lingered longer, neighbors complimented subtly, and curiosity grew. At the same time, the HOA remained silent. There were no letters, no fines, and no inspections. This quiet allowed the protagonist to continue without interruption, but it also created a tension. Every change could be scrutinized. Every arrangement could be challenged. The protagonist knew that the moment the HOA decided to inspect again, the work would be on full display. This knowledge added both pressure and excitement. The stakes were higher, but the strategy had been carefully planned. The protagonist began adding layers to the landscape. Low-growing plants were placed along the edges to soften boundaries, while small clusters of decorative stones created visual interest and natural separation between areas. Each addition was intentional, enhancing both aesthetics and practicality. The yard began to feel like a living painting, every element contributing to a larger composition. One afternoon, while arranging a group of flowering plants, the protagonist paused to step back and observe. The sunlight hit the leaves in a certain way, casting shadows that added depth and texture. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction, a reward for weeks of planning and labor. The transformation was no longer hypothetical. It was real, tangible, and undeniable. The yard had begun to take on a personality all its own, distinct from every other house on the street. Neighbors were becoming more observant. Few stopped to comment on the work, expressing admiration for the bold choices and attention to detail. Others whispered among themselves, curious about how far the transformation would go. The protagonist didn't engage in gossip. The focus remained on the work, on the vision, and on ensuring that every element contributed to the overall plan. There was a sense of quiet confidence growing, the understanding that careful planning and execution were far more powerful than anger or frustration. As the third week approached, the protagonist introduced another element, subtle decorative features that added texture without violating HOA rules. A small wooden bench was placed strategically under the shade of a shrub, creating a peaceful nook. Natural stones were stacked in low arrangements, forming focal points that drew the eye. Even small details like the spacing of flowers or the alignment of stones were carefully considered. Each addition reinforced the sense that the yard was no longer ordinary. It was thoughtful, intentional, and undeniably beautiful. Work continued each morning and evening, sometimes interrupted by rain or heat, but always resumed with determination. The protagonist moved deliberately, imagining the effect of each change from multiple angles. It wasn't enough for the yard to look good from one perspective. It had to feel harmonious from every viewpoint. This attention to detail required patience, but it was part of the larger strategy, creating a yard that could not easily be criticized. By the fourth week, the transformation had reached a stage where it was impossible to ignore. The combination of shrubs, flowers, pathways, and subtle decorative features created a cohesive look that felt natural yet artistic. The yard had depth, movement, and color, all carefully orchestrated to create a sense of beauty and harmony. Even from the street, the changes were obvious. The protagonist felt a quiet thrill, knowing that the work was progressing exactly as planned. Despite the satisfaction, there was an undercurrent of tension. The HOA could appear at any moment, expecting to find violations. The protagonist knew that the careful planning and research were critical, and that every plant, stone, and pathway needed to withstand scrutiny. This tension added focus, sharpening attention to detail. Each evening, adjustments were made, ensuring that edges were neat, plants were healthy, and pathways were clear. It was meticulous work, but the effort would soon pay off. Small victories continued. Birds and butterflies began visiting the new plants, adding life to the yard. Neighbors complimented subtly, their admiration evident in glances and quiet comments. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, providing sunlight and rain in just the right amounts to encourage growth. The protagonist felt a deep sense of connection to the space, not just as a yard, but as a living, evolving environment that reflected personal effort and creativity. By the end of the fourth week, the yard had been almost entirely transformed. What had once been a simple patch of grass was now a carefully designed space full of life, color, and movement. The pathways curved naturally, guiding visitors' eyes through the yard. Shrubs and flowers were arranged in patterns that felt both intentional and organic. Small, decorative elements added personality without violating any rules. The protagonist looked at the work with quiet pride, knowing that the next step would be the most exciting, the first full inspection by the HOA since the transformation began. The anticipation was tangible. Every letter, every notice, every interaction with the HOA could come at any moment. But the protagonist felt ready. The work had been deliberate, thoughtful, and thorough. The yard was now more than a garden. It was a statement. The subtle power of patience, creativity, and careful observation had turned frustration into opportunity. The HOA may have thought they had control, but the protagonist knew something they didn't. The transformation was unstoppable, and it was magnificent. As the sun set on the fourth week, the protagonist stood on the porch once more, surveying the yard. The soft light highlighted the curves of the pathways, the vibrant colors of flowers, and the carefully placed shrubs. Shadows danced across the ground, adding depth and texture. For a moment, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, as if recognizing the quiet power of the change. The protagonist smiled, feeling a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The real work had begun weeks ago, but now the results were visible, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. And so, the third chapter of this quiet rebellion came to a close. The yard had been transformed from a simple suburban lawn into a living work of art. Every plant, stone, and pathway had been chosen with care. Every element contributed to a vision that balanced beauty, practicality, and compliance. The HOA may have believed they had the upper hand, but in truth, the protagonist had already claimed it. The stage was set for the next phase, where the results would be tested and the quiet victory could finally begin to reveal itself. The morning felt different. The air was warmer, the birds chirped as usual, but there was a sense of anticipation lingering over the yard. The protagonist knew that the transformation was nearly complete. After weeks of planning, research, and careful work, the yard had become something extraordinary. But there was still one final step that carried tension and excitement. The HOA inspection. The letter from the HOA had arrived the previous evening. It stated they would be conducting a routine review of all properties in the neighborhood in the coming days. At first, there was a moment of apprehension. The protagonist knew that this was the moment when everything could either be recognized or challenged. Every plant, stone, and pathway would be visible under the scrutiny of those who had once dictated rules and threatened fines. But after a deep breath, the apprehension transformed into quiet confidence. The yard was ready. The day before the inspection, the protagonist moved through the yard slowly, adjusting small details. A few stray leaves were swept away. Some flowers were gently repositioned so they faced the sun. The stones in the pathways were realigned slightly to ensure smooth lines. Even the seating area under the shade of a shrub was checked for symmetry and balance. Each minor adjustment reinforced the feeling that everything had been prepared for this moment. The yard was no longer just plants and stones. It was a carefully orchestrated space designed to be appreciated, not criticized. Neighbors began to stir as well. Some had noticed the changes over the past weeks, and whispers of curiosity floated across fences. "Have you seen that yard?" one neighbor asked another. "It's completely different. I've never seen anything like it." The protagonist didn't respond to gossip. The focus remained entirely on the yard. After weeks of work, there was no need for validation. The beauty of the space itself was enough, and soon it would speak for itself in front of the HOA. When the inspectors finally arrived, they moved slowly down the street, clipboards in hand. Their eyes scanned every house, and when they reached the protagonist's property, they paused. The first glance took longer than expected. The yard had been transformed so completely that it seemed almost to demand attention. The curves of the pathways, the vibrant bursts of color, the subtle grouping of shrubs, the decorative stones created a scene that was both striking and harmonious. The inspectors exchanged quiet murmurs, perhaps uncertain how to proceed. The protagonist greeted them calmly at the front gate, offering a polite smile. There was no defensiveness, no explanation, only quiet confidence. The HOA officials stepped forward, taking their first official look at the work. They moved slowly, inspecting every section, examining plants, pathways, and even the seating area. Notes were taken, but the tone was noticeably different from previous inspections. There was no immediate mention of violations, no harsh reminders about compliance. Instead, there was a quiet pause, an almost reluctant admiration that could be felt in the way. They moved through the yard. Neighbors began to peek from windows and driveways. Drawn by the unusual stillness and attention at the protagonist's property, it wasn't long before whispers began. "They've really changed that yard," one said. "It's beautiful," another added. Even those who had once doubted the design now seemed impressed by the transformation. It was a moment of quiet triumph, but the protagonist stayed composed. Letting the work speak for itself, the inspection continued for nearly an hour. The HOA officials checked every detail carefully, looking for any technical violations, but finding none. The yard was not only compliant with the rules, but also enhanced in ways that improved the overall appearance of the property. Every decision, from plant selection to pathway design, had been made within the guidelines, but with creativity and thoughtfulness that elevated the space. It was clear that the rules were followed meticulously, yet the beauty of the yard was undeniable. At one point, one inspector stopped near the seating area, leaning slightly to get a better view. The shadows of the late morning sun highlighted the textures of the plants and stones, making the arrangement appear almost alive. The inspector nodded quietly, perhaps realizing that this was not a violation, but a carefully crafted work of design. The protagonist watched silently, heart steady, knowing that patience, planning, and careful execution were finally paying off. After the initial inspection, the HOA officials began discussing quietly among themselves. There was no loud disagreement, no mention of fines, no complaints about compliance. Instead, there was a sense of hesitation, a pause that suggested they were reconsidering their assumptions. The yard was different from any they had expected to find, and it had a presence that could not be ignored. Every path, plant, and stone had been placed with purpose, creating a balance that made criticism seem petty or unjustified. The protagonist, watching from the porch, felt a mixture of satisfaction and relief. Weeks of effort, careful observation, and subtle experimentation had led to this moment. The transformation was complete, and the results were undeniable. The tension that had been building for days began to dissolve, replaced by quiet pride in the work that had been done. This was more than just a yard. It was a statement, a demonstration of what could be achieved when patience and creativity were combined. Neighbors, who had stopped to watch, began to comment quietly among themselves. "I didn't think it could look this good," one said. "They really thought about every detail," another added. The protagonist remained silent, letting the yard speak for itself. There was no need to explain, defend, or boast. The work was visible, clear, and impossible to ignore. After completing their review, the HOA officials finally turned to the protagonist. There were polite comments, acknowledging the care and effort put into the yard. No fines were mentioned, no further demands made. The inspectors left without incident, moving on to the next property. But even as they walked away, there was a sense that they had seen something unexpected, something that challenged their assumptions about control and compliance. The moment the inspectors left, a quiet celebration began in the protagonist's mind. There was no need for loud fanfare or dramatic gestures. The victory was subtle but powerful. Weeks of planning, hard work, and careful execution had paid off. The yard was now a harmonious blend of beauty and compliance, space that reflected personal effort, creativity, and determination. The quiet satisfaction of achieving this without confrontation was deeply rewarding. In the days following the inspection, neighbors continued to notice the transformation. Some stopped to compliment directly, while others admired from a distance. Conversations about the yard spread quietly, often with amazement at the thoughtfulness of the design. The protagonist welcomed these reactions, but remained focused on the ongoing care of the space. The yard was alive, and attention to detail remained important to ensure that every plant, pathway, and decorative element continued to thrive as the sun set each evening. The protagonist would walk slowly through the yard, observing the changes and reflecting on the journey The shadows cast by shrubs and flowers created new patterns. The stone paths guided the eye in ways that felt dynamic, and the colors shifted with the fading light. Every step through the yard reminded the protagonist of the careful planning and hard work that had led to this point. The HOA had thought they had control, but the transformation proved otherwise. There was also a sense of personal growth. The process had taught patience, observation, and creative problem-solving. It had shown that frustration could be turned into motivation, that challenges could be transformed into opportunities, and that careful planning and thoughtful execution could achieve results far beyond what was initially expected. The yard was not just a space. It was a reflection of resilience, creativity, quiet determination. The protagonist began making small improvements daily, not out of necessity, but to enhance the experience of the space. Water features were added, subtle lighting was installed, and small seating areas were arranged to provide quiet corners for reflection. Every addition was intentional, enhancing the harmony of the yard without altering its compliance. The sense of satisfaction grew, and each evening walk through the space became a moment of quiet pride and contentment. Neighbors continued to react positively. Some were inspired to make subtle changes in their own yards, creating a ripple effect throughout the neighborhood. Conversations about design and landscaping became more common, and the protagonist quietly observed as others began to embrace creativity within the HOA guidelines. The yard had become more than a personal victory. It was an example of how patience, strategy, creativity could transform a space and influence others. By the end of the week, the yard had become fully established. Plants were rooted, pathways settled, and decorative elements integrated seamlessly into the design. The space was vibrant, balanced, and undeniably beautiful. The HOA had inspected and found no faults. Neighbors were intrigued and impressed, and the protagonist, standing quietly on the porch, felt a deep sense of accomplishment. This was a victory achieved not through confrontation, but through planning, observation, and thoughtful action. Looking back, the protagonist realized that the process had been about much more than just the yard. It had been a lesson in patience, creativity, and perseverance. Every letter from the HOA, every moment of frustration, every late night of planning had contributed to a larger understanding that control could be reclaimed quietly, thoughtfully, and effectively. The yard was the proof of that lesson, a living testament to what could be achieved with careful strategy and determination. The fourth chapter of this story closed with a sense of calm triumph. The HOA had inspected, the work had been recognized, and the transformation was complete. The yard was no longer just a space of grass and flowers. It was a carefully designed, vibrant, and thriving environment that reflected effort, vision, and quiet resilience. The protagonist had turned challenge into opportunity, frustration into creativity, and rules into a framework for beauty. And as the evening light faded across the yard, the protagonist stood on the porch, sipping tea, and simply watched. There was satisfaction in the work, pride in the process, and quiet joy in the realization that this transformation had been achieved without conflict, without compromise, and without losing the personal touch that made it truly remarkable. The stage was set for the final part of this story, where reflection, lasting impact, and a sense of enduring triumph would take center stage. The morning sun poured over the yard, highlighting the transformation in all its glory. After weeks of careful planning, patient work, and subtle strategy, the yard had become a masterpiece of balance, color, and life. It was hard to believe that just a month ago, this space had been the source of so much frustration. Now, it radiated calm, beauty, and quiet power. The protagonist stood on the porch, sipping coffee, and simply took it in, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA had inspected, seen the work, and found no violations. The letters had stopped, and for the first time there was a sense of freedom in the yard. No longer was it a space limited by rules and threats. It had become a canvas where creativity and compliance coexisted in perfect harmony. The struggle with the HOA had not only been about rules, it had been about personal expression, about patience, and about proving that thoughtful action could overcome arbitrary constraints Neighbors began to notice the final results in full. Some stopped to compliment directly, unable to contain their admiration. "Your yard looks amazing," one said, eyes wide. "I didn't think it could be done," another added. There was a mixture of surprise and respect in their voices, and the protagonist smiled politely, quietly proud but not boastful. The yard spoke for itself. Every flower, shrub, pathway, and stone told a story of careful planning, patience, and creativity. Even those who had been skeptical or dismissive now seemed impressed. A few neighbors, who had previously questioned the changes or whispered doubts, now paused to look, their expressions softening. Some even asked questions about the plants, pathways, and design. The protagonist answered politely, sharing advice here and there, but never revealing the full strategy behind the transformation. The satisfaction wasn't just in recognition. It was in knowing that the work had been done thoughtfully, skillfully, and quietly. Life around the yard began to change subtly. Birds and butterflies were drawn to the flowers, adding movement and life to the space. Bees hummed through the colorful clusters, and small insects carried pollen from plant to plant. Even the sunlight seemed to highlight the yard differently now, catching the curves of the pathways, the textures of the leaves, and the vibrant bursts of color. It was no longer just a yard. It had become a living ecosystem, thriving and evolving naturally. The protagonist spent time walking through the yard each morning and evening, adjusting small details and observing growth. Some flowers were replanted for better effect. Small stones were shifted slightly to refine the curves, and the seating area was rearranged occasionally to enhance comfort and balance. Each adjustment wasn't about correcting mistakes. It was about maintaining and improving a space that had already reached a level of excellence. This attention reinforced the idea that beauty required care, patience, and constant observation. As days passed, the impact of the yard began to ripple through the neighborhood. Some neighbors, inspired by the transformation, started making subtle improvements to their own properties. One rearranged flower beds in a more creative pattern. Another added small shrubs and plants in previously empty corners. Conversations about design, landscaping, and personal creativity became more common. And the protagonist quietly noticed these changes with a sense of satisfaction. The yard had not only achieved personal triumph, it inspired a subtle shift in the neighborhood. The protagonist also reflected on the journey itself. What had begun as a frustrating encounter with strict rules had evolved into a lesson in patience, strategy, and creative problem-solving. Every letter from the HOA, every late night of sketching, and every sore muscle from planting had been part of a process that built more than just a yard. It had built resilience, confidence, and a deeper understanding of what could be achieved when thoughtfulness met action. The transformation had been as much internal as it had been external. One afternoon, the protagonist took a moment to sit quietly on the bench in the yard, feeling the breeze and listening to the sounds of life. Birds chirped, leaves rustled softly, and insects hummed through the flowers. The space felt complete, not just visually, but emotionally. There was a sense of peace and accomplishment that came from knowing that every decision, every detail, had been intentional. The yard had become a reflection of the protagonist's perseverance, creativity, and ability to turn obstacles into opportunities. Even the HOA, quietly observing from afar, seemed to recognize the success. There were no more letters, no warnings, and no new inspections targeted at this property. It was as if the transformation had spoken for itself, showing that compliance and creativity could coexist. The protagonist didn't need their approval or acknowledgement. The victory was in the results and the quiet satisfaction that came from achieving something meaningful without confrontation. The neighbors' reactions continued to reinforce this sense of accomplishment. Children played along the pathways, laughing and stepping carefully around flower beds. Adults stopped to admire the yard, sometimes asking questions or commenting on specific details. The protagonist answered politely, but without seeking praise. The joy was in seeing the space alive, appreciated, and thriving, a living demonstration of what could be done with care and vision. As the weeks turned into months, the yard continued to evolve naturally. Plants matured, flowers bloomed in sequence, and pathways became familiar routes for those who walked through the space. The decorative stones weathered slightly, adding character without losing their intentional placement. The seating area became a favorite spot for quiet reflection, reading, or simply enjoying the beauty of the surroundings. The yard had become more than a victory. It had become a sanctuary. The protagonist often reflected on the contrast between the beginning of this journey and the present moment. What had started as a frustrating interaction with the HOA, a challenge that had seemed limiting and unfair, had turned into a process of transformation and growth. The lessons learned went beyond landscaping. Patience, strategic thinking, observation, and creative problem-solving had been tested and refined. Every setback, every letter, and every small moment of doubt had contributed to a deeper understanding of perseverance. The quiet victories in the yard had ripple effects in other areas of life as well. The protagonist felt more confident in decision-making, more capable of handling challenges, and more willing to trust in careful planning over rushed reactions. The experience with the HOA had been a catalyst for personal growth, reinforcing that obstacles could be turned into opportunities when approached thoughtfully and patiently. The yard had become a symbol of resilience, creativity, and the power of subtle, deliberate action. Occasionally, neighbors asked for advice about plant selection, pathways, and decorative touches. The protagonist shared insights generously, helping others enhance their spaces while encouraging individuality and creativity. The joy wasn't in recognition, but in seeing the effects of thoughtful design spreading through the neighborhood. The yard had become more than a personal accomplishment. It had become a quiet inspiration for others, showing that compliance did not have to mean conformity, and that rules could guide without stifling creativity. The protagonist also noticed the subtle pride in the community. Streets that had seemed uniform and controlled began to show signs of variation and personal expression. Small details in other yards reflected the influence of the transformed space. From colorful flower arrangements to creative pathways, there was a sense of balance emerging, a neighborhood where individuality could flourish within reasonable limits. The protagonist smiled quietly, recognizing that the work had an impact far beyond the confines of the original yard. Even the plants themselves seemed to reward the effort. Flowers thrived in their carefully chosen locations. Shrubs provided structure and shade, and the pathways guided both eye and foot naturally through the space. Birds and butterflies visited regularly, adding life and movement that enhanced the visual impact. The yard was no longer a simple patch of land, it was a living environment that grew, adapted, and reflected care, intention, and creativity. Looking back, protagonists realized that the true victory was not just in satisfying the HOA or avoiding fines. It was in the process itself, in turning frustration into planning, creativity into action, and rules into a framework for excellence. The yard had become a reflection of what could be achieved with patience, observation, and determination. It was a reminder that obstacles were often opportunities in disguise, and that thoughtful action could transform challenges into meaningful, lasting results. Evenings became a time for quiet reflection. The protagonist would walk slowly along the pathways, observing the plants, the shadows, and the subtle movements of the natural world. There was a sense of completeness, not in the idea of perfection, but in the harmony of effort, design, and natural growth. The yard was alive, vibrant, and undeniably beautiful, a product of deliberate care and personal investment. In the end, the yard stood as a symbol of quiet triumph. The HOA had thought they had control, but the protagonist had turned rules, restrictions, and frustration into a canvas for creativity and personal expression. The neighbors had seen the transformation, learned from it, and even drawn inspiration for their own spaces. The community had changed subtly, embracing individuality while maintaining harmony. And the protagonist, having weathered challenges with patience, strategy, and determination, could enjoy the full satisfaction of a victory earned without confrontation. The story closed with the protagonist standing on the porch, watching the yard in the soft light of evening. Birds settled among the shrubs, insects hummed through the flowers, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of blooms across the property. The space was alive, thriving and full of quiet beauty. The journey had been long, but every step had been worth it. What had started as frustration with rules and limitations had become a lasting achievement, an environment that reflected care, creativity, and perseverance. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, the protagonist took a final deep breath, feeling the satisfaction of work well done. The yard was no longer just a space to comply with rules. It was a statement, sanctuary, and a testament to what could be achieved when patience, vision, and thoughtful action were combined. The HOA had thought they had won, but the protagonist had quietly, completely, and beautifully changed the entire landscape.